Didn't Brian Scott know about the open, broken basement window? Did he? Did he or didn't he? What do you think? That's a question to write down in your notebook right now. Did Brian Scott know about the open, broken basement window? Write down your answer right there and let's see if it's correct. Now, this is information that is absolutely critical to the defense case. And here you have an invaluable witness, or perhaps even a suspect. It's one or the other. Which do you think it is?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. And that brings us to 5 insights from Brian Scott. Number 1. Scott noticed a broken window in the basement, but not the broken window. Now, you could argue that Brian Scott not noticing the broken window in the grate is carelessness from the gardener or even suspicious, except the gardener was aware of a broken window in the basement. And for those details, let's dip into Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Linda Arndt re-interviewed the Ramsey's gardener, Brian Scott. She had already spoken to him earlier in the month. Scott, who had graduated from the University of Colorado the year before, told the detective that he'd started working for the Ramseys in June 1995 as a landscaper. Now, either his memory is faulty, all of this time later, or this information in Schiller's book is incorrect. It's just interesting that there is a bit of a discrepancy there. The last time he was at the house was December 10th. That's also interesting. He was in the garden as late as 2 weeks before the incident, right? He was on the grounds in the middle of winter, so he would have experienced 2 winters in the Ramsey garden. Now, the family used large wooden candy canes to decorate the yard during the holidays. We've all seen them. And so Brian Scott was the person who put them there, right? And he noticed that they hadn't been arranged properly, and he went to some trouble to make sure that they could stand up, right, in the ground. They needed deeper holes, and he dug them before pounding them into the ground. Detective Arndt asked him what he remembered about the window well grate near the rear patio. To her credit, that was a very important question to ask. And so what did he say? What did he answer? Scott said he didn't remember that the window was broken. He didn't say, I didn't look down there. He didn't say, I didn't know what was going on down there. He said he didn't remember it was broken. He also said he'd only been in the basement to fix the sprinkler clock. He didn't know there was a wine cellar, much less where it was. This is also important. He did recall a broken window at the front of the house that's also in the basement area, right? This is below Burke Ramsey's room. But it was for the electrical cord for the Christmas lights and certainly not big enough for someone to crawl through, something like 2 inches square. Now, if you think about that, that's a broken window that was probably broken to allow the Christmas lights through. Now, I'm not sure if it would have been broken that Christmas or previous Christmas. And that would certainly be a question that I would want to ask the gardener or perhaps ask the Ramseys. Now, if you think about that, isn't that broken basement window an analogy for another broken basement window? Isn't that perhaps where the idea came from? In any event, while Scott adjusted the candy canes along the front walk, he said that he saw a blue Chevy Suburban pull up to collect JonBenet. She was wearing a pair of blue overalls and was being bratty about something. Now, that comment also gives us a sense of the real JonBenet, that JonBenet could also be a handful. That was also something that the housekeeper also said. And so the gardener observes this and says, I think she might have been giving orders, Scott said. I don't know if that means JonBenet was, but it seems like it, meaning JonBenet was giving someone orders, saying something like, you get in the back, you do this, something like that. Now, perhaps she was giving orders to another child in the car. Perhaps she was giving orders to her brother, who knows. A moment later, the car was gone, and he said that was the last time he saw JonBenet. Now, this is a rare glimpse into the spirit of JonBenet, a little child that did have her own sense of identity, that did stand up for herself. And you can imagine within the context of this crime, whatever it was, she also stood up for herself in some way. She resisted what was happening to her. When she felt pain, she objected to it and did so with a piercing, blood-curdling scream. This little anecdote from the gardener gives JonBenet a little bit of a voice in her own story, doesn't it? Now, can I share my opinion on Brian Scott? Because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of you saying, oh, I think he did it. I believe Brian Scott is an important witness, not a suspect. For starters, none of his samples were a match, not his DNA, not his hair, or his handwriting. And if he really wanted to take JonBenet, why do so with a house full of people when he knew that John was away half the time? Also, why would he go straight from his girlfriend to the Ramsey home? And then another reason I believe Brian Scott is it reinforces the same thing the housekeeper said. She never noticed the broken window in the basement either, nor did she clean up any glass. So think about it. On this important first point, if we accept Brian Scott and Linda Hoffman-Pugh's statements, then the basement window possibly wasn't broken prior to December 1996. Now we're going to run through the other 4 insights relatively quickly. Number 2, leaves in winter. Going back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, that evening, he said, I left a big pile of leaves out front by the gutter for her to play with. That's also an area below Burke Ramsey's room. That was probably the last time I spoke to JonBenet. 6 weeks later, I took the morning paper from my front steps and saw it, the news of this incident. And so what this reveals is 6 weeks earlier, he left a big pile of leaves for JonBenet to play with. Brian Scott was at the Ramsey home as recently as 10 days before the incident. And so in this period when he wasn't there, wouldn't there have been a buildup of leaves during that period? I mean, after he raked up a huge pile of leaves. And if JonBenet played in this last pile of leaves he raked up, surely that leaf debris would be on the lawn, some of it, and ought to have been picked up perhaps on the wet shoes of the intruder and carried into the home. Did that happen? Number 3, snow in the walkways. Who would be a better person to describe their observations regarding the nuances of snow and frost on grass and walkways in Boulder than the Ramsey's own gardener, and on this particular property in particular? Number 4, Burke as an introvert. Perhaps some of the best insights we get from the gardener, and quite surprisingly, are regarding the family dynamics. Burke, he's described as a loner and an introvert. Did he become that way, or was he that way all along? Because he doesn't seem so introverted when we see him running around the church. Is he that introverted when he speaks to Detective Dan Schuller, or Dr. Suzanne Bernard, or Dr. Phil? I mean, that's quite an interesting question in and of itself. Is Burke an introvert? Number 5, absent father. Now, this part came up in this interview with CBS, also came up in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, where he says, last year my dad and I did that, meaning my dad raked up the leaves and I jumped in them. And that's the part that I think the FBI profiler misses here, where the reference to the leaves, the gardener thinks quite interesting, quite funny, but the profiler misses the fact that JonBenet had such a good time with her father that she asks the gardener to recreate that. And then not only that, but says, I miss him, I miss my father, and she actually starts crying. So this was a significant factor in JonBenet's little life, that she didn't see her father very often. And the gardener didn't see him very much either, didn't see John Ramsey very much either, said that he saw him once a season. And the gardener even quizzed JonBenet about this. JonBenet said, I really miss him, meaning John. I wish John, my dad, was around more. And then he said, where does he go? And the JonBenet said, I don't know. And obviously the answer was that he would go on business trips. And I seem to remember a housekeeper saying that John was around about once a week. And remember, he was trying to create a $1 billion company that requires effort and investment and time away from home. But JonBenet did say this, sometimes he goes away for a long time. And then the gardener said, you really miss him? And then she said, yeah, I really miss him a lot. Then she started to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. So that wasn't just a throwaway statement. This was a big deal to this little girl. And that brings up this idea of neglect. How often was John away? Did he know what was going on with JonBenet? Should he have known? Should he have known that certain things were going on with her? And I also think it rubs out this whole idea of John being some kind of perpetrator. Well, he was never home to be a perpetrator. That even goes for Christmas Day, where John disappeared for 2 or 3 hours by his own admission on Christmas Day, even when he was supposed to be home. Even when he was technically home, he left the home for several hours. And although he says he went to the airport to put things into the airplane, ostensibly the Ramseys packed and some of that went into the airplane, I can't help wondering whether John was tempted to go to work and do some work on that particular day.
One of the things I remember was when they announced the OJ verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty of the crime of murder.
I was at their house.
You were outside working on the garden.
Patsy came out and told me that OJ was declared innocent.
Really?
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
I just remember, she came out and started talking to me about it.
Patsy?
Yeah, she thought OJ got away with murder. She didn't like that one bit. She did say, you can get away with murder in this country.
That anecdote is also in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. I can't help thinking Jim Clemente read that book and wanted to get these sort of snippets on video, on camera, in terms of, what he'd already said in that book. But think about it. A year after OJ got away with murder, someone else would get away with killing JonBenet. And 28 years later, they still are. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.